Caroline Crouch was only 20 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, a bright, kind young woman adored by her friends and family. She was a new mother, living in what seemed to be a picture-perfect world. Her husband, Babis Anagnostopoulos, was a charming, successful pilot, and they had a beautiful baby girl together, Lydia. From the outside, Caroline's life looked like a dream, a loving family, a promising future, and a bond that appeared unshakable. But on May 11th, 2021, everything changed. The dream ended, and a nightmare began. In the early hours of that morning, a desperate call to police sent shockwaves through Athens. Barbas claimed that masked intruders had broken into their home. He described a violent robbery where his wife was murdered in front of their infant daughter. The story was terrifying, tragic, and believable. For 37 days, the people of Greece mourned Caroline, rallying behind the grieving husband and father. The media shared Babis's heartbreaking words, his tears, and his pleas for justice. The world believed his pain was real. But as the days passed, cracks in his story began to emerge. Small inconsistencies in timelines, strange gaps in evidence, things that didn't add up. Investigators kept digging, and when the truth was revealed, it wasn't just shocking, it was horrifying. Who was Caroline Crouch before her name became synonymous with tragedy? What dreams did she hold? And how did her life lead to such a heartbreaking end? Caroline Louise Crouch was born on July 12, 2001, in Athens, Greece. Her father, David, was a retired British engineer, and her mother, Susan, hailed from the Philippines. As a child, Caroline was curious, vibrant, and full of life. Her family moved to the island of Alonissos when she was just 8 years old, and there Caroline grew up surrounded by the beauty of the sea and the simplicity of island life. Alonissos was a paradise for the young Caroline. The island's turquoise waters and golden beaches became her playground. She loved scuba diving, swimming, and exploring the marine life that thrived in the crystal-clear seas. Her parents often described her as adventurous and fearless, someone who embraced challenges and pursued her passions wholeheartedly. But while her childhood was idyllic, Caroline, like any teenager, dreamed of excitement and romance. At 15, during a local Good Friday parade, Caroline's life changed forever. It was there that she met Babis Anagnostopoulos, a man 12 years her senior, who would later become her husband. Baz was no ordinary man. He was a commercial helicopter pilot, a profession that exuded sophistication and success. To a young Caroline, he seemed like the embodiment of a fairy tale prince. He was charming, confident, and eager to win her heart, and he knew exactly how to do it, flying his helicopter over her school, capturing her attention in the most extravagant way possible. What teenage girl wouldn't be flattered by such a grand gesture? For Caroline, it was like a dream come true. Their relationship began swiftly, with Babis showering her with attention and promises of a life filled with adventure. But even in the early days, their relationship raised eyebrows. The 12-year age gap was significant, and many wondered what a grown man saw in a 15-year-old girl. Yet Caroline's family trusted her judgment. Her parents wanted her to be happy and supported her decisions. By the time Caroline turned 18, her relationship with Babis had only grown stronger. The couple decided to take their love to the next level. On July 15, 2019, they eloped to Portugal, exchanging vows in a small, intimate ceremony. It wasn't the traditional Greek wedding one might expect, a grand celebration surrounded by family and friends. Instead, it was quiet and private, just the two of them. To Caroline, it felt romantic and adventurous. To Babis, it seemed to mark the beginning of his control. After the wedding, the couple returned to Greece and settled in a 2-story maisonette in Glykonera, a suburb of Athens. Their life appeared perfect. Social media painted a picture of happiness. Weekends by the sea, romantic getaways, and later, the arrival of their baby girl, Lydia. But, as we know, appearances can be deceiving. Have you ever looked at a picture-perfect couple and wondered what might be hidden beneath the surface? Sometimes, The truth lies far from what we see. From the outside, Caroline Crouch's life seemed like the perfect dream. After their wedding, she and Babis settled into a picturesque life in Athens. Their two-story home in Glycanera looked warm and inviting, and their social media was a scrapbook of happy moments, romantic vacations, family outings, and of course their greatest joy, their baby girl Lydia. But as is often the case, what people saw on the outside was far from the truth. Behind closed doors, the cracks in Caroline and Babis's relationship were growing deeper and harder to ignore. The fairy tale that once seemed so enchanting was quickly unraveling. Caroline, a vibrant and independent young woman, found herself increasingly isolated. Babis, once the charming and attentive husband, became controlling and manipulative. He monitored her movements, dictated who she could speak to, and slowly chipped away at her sense of self. To her family and friends she put on a brave face, but her true feelings were revealed in the pages of her diary. In her diary, Caroline poured out her emotions. She wrote about the arguments, the tension, and her growing sense of entrapment. One entry read, "I love Bobby so much, but this relationship hurts me. I feel like I'm drowning." Her words were raw and heartbreaking, a window into the struggles she faced daily. Me of a day when someone was killed across the countryside, she tried to reach her friends and her lover. Her husband Letitia had left her to meet the man she loved. She took her hope that the two of them would soon be back together again, and the options for burying Lydia. She even searched for hotels where they could stay, away from Babis. But despite her fears and the pain she was enduring, she held on to hope. She believed, or perhaps wished, that things would get better. But why didn't she leave? This is a question many people ask in situations like Caroline's. The answer is rarely simple. Caroline was young, deeply in love, and a new mother. She wanted to keep her family together for Lydia's sake. She wanted to believe that Babis could change, and maybe, like so many others, she was afraid of what might happen if she did leave. Babis, on the other hand, saw Caroline's independence as a threat. The once romantic gestures that swept her off her feet turned into calculated acts of control. He held the purse strings, managed the household, and left little room for Caroline to make decisions of her own. Over time, this imbalance of power left her feeling like a prisoner in her own home. To the outside world, their life continued to look perfect. Caroline continued to post photos on social media, smiling with Lydia, celebrating milestones and presenting a happy front. But those close to her noticed subtle changes. Her once bubbly personality seemed muted. Her adventurous spirit, which had flourished during her years on Alanisos, seemed to have faded. Caroline's parents, David and Susan, also began to worry. Though they lived on Alanisos, far from Caroline's home in Athens, they could sense that something wasn't right. They encouraged her to visit, to take a break. But Caroline's responses were brief and dismissive. It was clear that something was weighing heavily on her mind. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is that Caroline had a way out. She had the support of her parents and friends who loved her deeply. But like so many victims of controlling relationships, she felt trapped, caught between fear, love, and a hope that things might one day return to how they were. In the months leading up to her tragic death, Caroline's entries became increasingly somber. She wrote about a particular argument that left her feeling devastated, describing how Babis's behavior made her feel powerless. "I stayed with him so my daughter would not grow up without her two parents," she wrote in one entry. It was a painful admission, one that spoke to her deep sense of responsibility as a mother and her desire to shield Lydia from pain. Have you ever looked at a picture-perfect couple and wondered what might be hidden beneath the surface? Sometimes, the truth lies far from what we see. It was 6:20 a.m. on May 11, 2021, when a chilling call was made to the Greek police emergency line. On the other end was Babis Anagnostopoulos, his voice muffled, frantic, and barely comprehensible. He told the operator that 3 armed men had broken into his home in Glycanera, demanding money and valuables. He claimed they had tied him up, murdered his wife, and fled the scene. Officers raced to the scene, arriving at the house just minutes later. From the outside, everything looked quiet, Still, a picturesque home in a peaceful neighborhood. But inside, it was a completely different story. As the police entered, they were greeted by chaos. The living room was completely ransacked. Drawers had been yanked open, their contents dumped onto the floor, clothes and belongings were scattered everywhere. On the staircase, a sight that would haunt even the most seasoned officers, Roxy, the family's husky, hung lifelessly from her leash. It was clear that this was no ordinary robbery. Moving upstairs, they reached the bedroom. The scene there was even more horrifying. Lying face down on the bed was Caroline Crouch, lifeless and pale. Beside her, their 11-month-old daughter Lydia was crying and clapping her tiny hands, as if trying to wake her mother. On the floor near the bed was Babis, bound and gagged with duct tape. Struggling to free himself, the officers worked quickly, cutting the tape that restrained Babis and checking on Lydia. Caroline, tragically, was beyond saving. She had been smothered to death, a pillow pressed so forcefully against her face that her struggle for air would have lasted minutes, a horrifyingly slow and violent death. Lydia, though distressed, was unharmed physically. As the officers began their initial examination of the scene, something about it didn't sit right. While the chaos in the house suggested a robbery, certain details felt off. The basement window where Barbas claimed the intruders had entered showed no clear signs of forced entry. The surveillance camera in the living room had been dismantled, its memory card missing, but there were no signs of a struggle in that area of the house. Then there was the matter of the Monopoly box. Babis had told police he kept E110000 in cash there, savings intended for the family's dream home. The box had been overturned and emptied, its contents presumably stolen. But how had the robbers known to look there? It was an unusual hiding spot, one that most people wouldn't think to check without prior knowledge. The most disturbing question of all, however, was why the intruders had chosen to kill Caroline. If their intent was robbery, why escalate to such brutal violence, especially with a child present? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary crime. Once freed, Babis recounted the harrowing events of the night. He told police that 3 masked men, armed and speaking with Greek and Albanian accents, had entered their home through the basement window. He claimed they immediately restrained him, tying his hands and feet and taping his mouth shut to prevent him from screaming. To the untrained ear, his story sounded plausible, but to the officers on the scene, something didn't quite add up. How had Babis managed to make the emergency call while tied up and gagged? And why had the intruders taken the time to kill the family dog? These were details that didn't fit the typical profile of a home invasion. If you heard Babis's story that night, would you have believed him? Sometimes, the truth hides in the smallest inconsistencies. The murder of Caroline Crouch sent shockwaves through Greece. A young mother killed in her own home, her baby left crying beside her. This wasn't just a crime. It was a tragedy that demanded swift action. The Greek Crimes Against Life Department, known for handling the country's most complex cases, took immediate charge of the investigation. Authorities wasted no time. Within hours of the crime, they offered a Euro 300,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the robbers. The media broadcasted the story relentlessly, sharing Babis's tearful interviews and his calls for justice. It seemed like everyone in Greece wanted the culprits caught. But as investigators began piecing together the evidence, something didn't sit right. The first signs of doubt came from the house itself. Barbas had claimed that the intruders entered through a basement window. However, when detectives examined it closely, they found no evidence of forced entry. No broken glass, no tool marks, nothing. The window seemed untouched, raising the question, how had the robbers entered? Then there was the surveillance camera in the living room. According to Babis, the intruders had dismantled it and removed the memory card. But when investigators checked the camera's system, they discovered a crucial detail. The memory card had been removed at 1:20 a.m., nearly 3 hours before Babis claimed the robbers arrived. These inconsistencies were enough to make detectives pause, but they were far from conclusive. What they needed was hard evidence, something irrefutable that could either confirm or contradict Babis's story. That evidence came from an unexpected source: Caroline's smartwatch. Caroline had been wearing a fitness smartwatch the night she died, a device that recorded her heart rate, movements, and even sleep patterns. When investigators analyzed the data, they made a shocking discovery. According to the watch, Caroline's heart had stopped beating at 4:11 a.m., well before the time Babis claimed the intruders fled the scene. This revelation turned the timeline upside down. If Caroline had died before the supposed robbery, then who, or what, was responsible for her death? And why would Babis lie about the timing? Investigators knew they were getting closer to the truth, but there was still more to uncover. The smartwatch data also revealed signs of extreme physical stress before Caroline's death, consistent with a struggle. This finding directly contradicted Babis's claim that she had been overpowered quickly and without resistance. Caroline had fought for her life, and her final moments were far more harrowing than her husband described. While the evidence against Babis began to mount, investigators turned their attention to his own movements that night. They analyzed his smartphone, looking for any activity during the hours he claimed to have been tied up and unconscious. What they found was damning. Data from Babis's fitness app revealed that he had been moving around the house during the time he was supposedly restrained. Steps were logged, and activity was recorded, clear indications that he was anything but unconscious. This discovery raised serious doubts about his version of events and shifted the focus of the investigation squarely onto him. Further scrutiny of Babis's emergency call to the police revealed another inconsistency. He had claimed to have dialed the number with his nose while bound and gagged, but reenactments conducted by investigators showed that this would have been nearly impossible given the restraints described. Piece by piece, his story was falling apart.
As the evidence piled up, the story of what happened that night began to take shape. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the culmination of a relationship gone horribly wrong. Nathaniel's obsession with Lauren had spiraled into violence. The question now was, why?
Bass's behavior in the days following Caroline's death was also scrutinized. While he appeared emotional in interviews, his actions told a different story. He showed no hesitation in returning to the house where the crime occurred, and his interactions with police were unusually cooperative, almost too cooperative. It was as if he wanted to steer the investigation in a specific direction. By this point, the case was no longer about finding masked robbers. Investigators were beginning to see a much darker possibility, that the person responsible for Caroline's death wasn't an intruder at all. But if Babis was guilty, why would he stage such an elaborate scene? And what could have driven him to commit such a horrific act? Detectives knew they needed to tread carefully. Accusing a grieving husband was no small step, and the public still largely saw Babis as a victim. The investigation had to be airtight, leaving no room for doubt. With the smartwatch data, the surveillance footage, and the inconsistencies in Babis's statements, they were getting closer to the truth. But they needed one final piece to complete the puzzle. Have you ever noticed how the smallest details can unravel the biggest lies? In cases like these, even a single inconsistency can reveal the truth. June 17, 2021. A day that marked the turning point in the investigation into Caroline Crouch's murder. For 37 days, Babis Anagnostoulos had presented himself as a grieving husband, cooperating fully with authorities and pleading with the public to help bring the killers to justice. But that facade was about to crumble. On that day, police requested that Babis travel to Athens, claiming they had uncovered new evidence in the case. At the time, Babis was attending a memorial service for Caroline on the island of Alonisos. Surrounded by friends, family, and mourners, Babis appeared solemn, even emotional. He had spoken openly about his love for Caroline, calling her the light of his life, and vowing to find her killers. Little did he know, the detectives standing in the crowd were watching him closely, preparing to change the course of his life forever. Bass was flown to Athens under the pretense of helping to identify a potential suspect. But when he arrived at the General Police Directorate, he wasn't greeted with a suspect lineup. Instead, he was escorted into a small, quiet interrogation room. There, detectives began to present the mountain of evidence they had accumulated against him. They started with the timeline. The smartwatch data, the missing surveillance footage, the inconsistencies in his story, all laid out methodically. For hours, Babis listened as the detectives unraveled his version of events, exposing every hole, every contradiction. His calm demeanor began to crack. "We know you weren't tied up when you made the call," one detective reportedly told him. "We know Caroline died hours before you said the robbers fled." Each statement was backed by hard evidence, leaving Babis with fewer and fewer places to hide. The room was tense, silent except for the voices of the investigators and the occasional shuffle of papers. Outside, the world remained unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors. For 8 hours, Babis maintained his innocence. He repeated the same story he had told since the beginning, that masked intruders had broken into their home and killed his wife. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of the evidence became too much. Finally, in the early hours of the next morning, Babis broke down. With his head in his hands, he began to speak. What he revealed left even the seasoned detectives stunned. He admitted to everything. There had been no robbery, no masked intruders, no violent criminals fleeing into the night. It had all been a lie, a carefully staged scene designed to cover up the terrible truth. According to Babis, the events of that night had been the result of a heated argument between him and Caroline. He claimed that Caroline had threatened to leave him, taking Lydia with her. This, he said, sent him into a fit of rage. In his own words, he described how he had pinned her down, pressing a pillow over her face until she stopped struggling. The act was deliberate, calculated, and chillingly cold. But his confession didn't stop there. Bobby admitted that after realizing what he had done, he panicked. Desperate to avoid the consequences, he decided to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. He ransacked the house, pulling out drawers and scattering belongings to make it look convincing. Then, in an act of shocking cruelty, he strangled the family's dog, Roxy, with her leash and hung her on the staircase to add another layer of deception. Finally, he tied himself up with duct tape and called the police, using his nose to dial the emergency number. When asked why he had gone to such lengths, Babis claimed it was to protect Lydia. "I didn't want her to grow up without both of her parents," he said. But his actions had ensured that Lydia would lose not only her mother, but her father as well. The detectives listened in silence, recording every word as Babis laid bare the truth behind the lies he had woven for over a month. News of Babis's confession spread quickly, shocking a nation that had rallied behind him. The image of a grieving husband, so publicly distraught, was shattered. People who had once sympathized with his plight now turned against him, their sorrow replaced by outrage. Caroline's family, who had stood by Babis and supported him in the days following her death, were devastated. Her father, David, expressed his disbelief, saying he had trusted Babis as a son-in-law and never imagined he could be capable of such an atrocity. The pain of losing Caroline was compounded by the betrayal they felt at being deceived by the man they had welcomed into their family. On May 16, 2022, the verdict was delivered. The jury unanimously found Babis guilty of premeditated murder, animal abuse, and providing false statements to the police. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was read. Life imprisonment for the murder of Caroline, an additional 10 years for the killing of Roxy, and 1 year for obstructing the investigation with his lies. As the sentence was announced, there was no visible reaction from Babis. He sat stoically, his once calm and composed demeanor now a mask of indifference. For Caroline's family, the verdict brought some measure of closure, though no punishment could ever undo the loss they had suffered. The court also ruled on the future of Lydia, Caroline and Babis's young daughter. Custody was awarded to Caroline's family, who vowed to give her the love and stability she deserved. Lydia was later moved to the Philippines, where she now lives with Caroline's maternal relatives, surrounded by extended family, who cherish her deeply. For the Greek public, the case was a betrayal of trust on an unimaginable scale. Bobis had not only committed an unspeakable crime, but had manipulated an entire nation into believing his fabricated story. His actions left scars that extended far beyond Caroline's family, touching the lives of everyone who followed the case. What would justice mean to you in a case like this? Is life imprisonment enough for the man who took so much from so many? Caroline Crouch's story is more than a tale of tragedy. It is a haunting reminder of how abuse can hide behind the illusion of love. To the outside world, Caroline and Bobis seemed like the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, their relationship was unraveling, marked by control, manipulation, and fear. Caroline's story has become a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of hidden abuse. Like many victims, Caroline felt trapped, torn between love, fear, and a hope that things might improve. Her diary entries, written in moments of despair, reveal a woman who recognized the toxicity of her relationship, but felt unable to leave. Domestic abuse is often shrouded in silence. Victims may fear judgment, retaliation, or the stigma of breaking up a family. For Caroline, these fears were compounded by her role as a young mother. She stayed for Lydia, hoping to shield her daughter from pain. Tragically, this decision cost her life. Today, Caroline's memory lives on through the efforts of her family and advocates for change. Her parents, David and Susan, have worked tirelessly to ensure that her death was not in vain. They have spoken publicly about the need for awareness and supported initiatives aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Lydia, now living with Caroline's maternal relatives in the Philippines, is a beacon of hope. Surrounded by love and care, she represents the future that Caroline wanted for her, a life free from fear and filled with happiness. Though she will grow up without her parents, Lydia will carry her mother's legacy with her. Caroline's story reminds us that the warning signs of abuse can be subtle and easy to dismiss. Have you ever wondered how many lives could be saved if we learned to recognize those signs and acted sooner? Thank you for watching this video. Caroline Crouch's story is a heartbreaking reminder of the need to address domestic violence and support those in need. By sharing her story, we can raise awareness and honor her memory by working toward a world where no one suffers in silence. If you found this video meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you help spread awareness and keep important conversations like this alive. Your support means everything to us. If you or someone you know needs help, reach out to a trusted friend, family member, or local support organization. Remember, help is always available,